there are many of you there. Um, I almost feel like a broadcaster. I have no idea how many people are listening and watching us. But you really enjoy this evening's program and the subject matter. Now, before I move along with the subject matter, uh, I want to thank our sponsors. And as we all know, this year is like no other. And to pull off this spiritual festival took quite getting many people to sponsor and many organizations to sponsor this program. So I want to thank you, our at-home sponsors. Our grand season sponsor is Carol and David Appel. Our platinum sponsor is Fry Family Foundation. Our presenting sponsors are Margot Hickson and Ian Reese, Randy and Lynn Legale, Ginny and Paul Green, and entire Music Niagara Board of Directors. Thank you so much. Now, our special event sponsors and supporters are Helis Little Almas and Murray LLP, Steinway Piano Gallery of Toronto, and Niagara College, right here in Niagara. Also, we thank you, the Ontario Arts Council, Ontario Creates, and the Government of Canada for really making this season possible. So, at this point, I'd like to introduce our host and moderator for this great debate. Subject matter is 250th anniversary of Beethoven and Beethoven himself. Many of you, myself included, remember 50 years ago the celebration throughout the world. Not sure if we're going to be around in 50 years, so we're really trying to celebrate. And our season, so it happened that the shows that you're going to see and hear, really practically all of them, most of them are about Beethoven and his music. I hope you tune in and look at our upcoming events. But for tonight, for this afternoon, here is Peter Hall from WNED across the river in Buffalo, the station, classical music station that we all listen so much, including myself. It's a really fabulous station. I sincerely mean it. One of the best classical music stations I've heard in the United States, and Canada for that matter. Not to upset anybody locally, but really the taste and selections that I always enjoy and always many times surprised by the selection of performers and pieces that being featured on WNED. So without further ado, here is Peter Hall.
Thank you, Atis. And I am surrounded by CBC music hosts, so better be on my best behavior. I'm retired mostly with WNED Classical, but still maintain a presence, and we're all part of Buffalo Toronto Public Media. So today we're going to enjoy a debate on the following resolution. Resolved. Beethoven represents the best of who we are. And arguing for the affirmative, that Beethoven does represent the best of who we are, is Tom Allen, host of CBC Music's classic music program, Shift. Tom is a lecturer and author of The Case of Four Missing Pages and the Only Canadian Who Met Beethoven, which is a whole lot of fun, by the way. Arguing for the negative is Robert Harris, retired CBC Music host, lecturer, and author of What to Listen For in Beethoven, who has graciously volunteered to argue that Beethoven does not represent the best of who we are. And later on, we'll have a guest perspective from Julie Nesrallah, acclaimed operatic mezzo-soprano and host of CBC Music's classical music program, Tempo. And mid-program, we'll hear as well from William Littler, longtime music columnist for the Toronto Star and participant in many previous great debates. Throughout the debate, we'll enjoy a number of musical interludes provided by Victoria Kogan and Atis Bankas. Pianist Victoria Kogan, educated at the Moscow Conservatory, has performed in many of the world's famous concert halls and has recorded the Beethoven piano concertos. Violinist Atis Bankas, who introduced our show today, is a longtime member of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, the first violinist of the Gould String Quartet, and along with all his other activities, is perhaps best known and loved by me, by our panelists, and by you in our audience today as the founder and artistic director of Music Niagara. For all you do, thank you, Atis. Now, before we begin, let's hear from the composer whose 250th birthday we're celebrating all year long. Victoria Kogan will play the first movement of Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 1. Thank you, Victoria, for that Beethoven Sonata 1, Movement No. 1. More music to follow. Stay with us. Now, before today's debate, I have been asked to provide a brief overview of Beethoven's world, a world which could be described as the time when the classical era changed over to the Romantic era. It was a time when top-down control in so many aspects of life butted up against the Enlightenment, with more focus on and trust in the common man, given the freedom to control his own destiny and rise through merit as opposed to birth. Beethoven was himself relatively low-born on December 16th in Bonn, sort of an outlier, a commoner, always something of an outsider, especially to the elites of Vienna, a city whose residents have always had a bit of an attitude towards anyone who was not born there. And you already knew about Beethoven, though, from the cartoon strip Peanuts. When piano-playing Schroeder was asked by Lucy for the meaning of life, Schroeder shouted in letters that filled the cartoon frame, "Beethoven! Beethoven is it!" And For many of us, Beethoven is the meaning of life. He was able to overcome a lot, including his early education at the hands of a violent, alcoholic father, a father he even had to take to court to force him to provide for the family. Beethoven's artistic output is typically divided into three periods: the early period, when he composed more in the style of Mozart and Haydn; the middle period, which saw the groundbreaking Third Symphony known as Eroica; and Beethoven's late style, some of which Beethoven himself admitted was for, and I quote, a later age. We might similarly describe the Enlightenment in Europe in those same ways. There was the early Enlightenment, sometimes called enlightened absolutism, with such rulers as Frederick the Great of Prussia, or Maria Theresa of Austria, or her son Joseph II, the last Holy Roman Empire, who, despite what you might think from his title, furthered the work of his mother: unification of the judicial system, abolition of feudalism, increased religious tolerance, and the introduction of compulsory education. And then there's the middle period of the Enlightenment, following the French Revolution, with the adoption of the Napoleonic Code of 1804, by the way, the year of Eroica. The code, which further early reforms by promoting meritocracy, equality before the law, property rights, modern secular education, sound finances, and the encouragement of science and the arts. So perhaps it's not a coincidence that 1804 is the year of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. Beethoven believed in the ideals of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and the brotherhood of man. And the story of his overreaction to hearing that his hero Napoleon had declared himself emperor, scratching out the dedication of Eroica, it might be exaggerated. Beethoven and Napoleon were more alike than we might think. There was one other time, though, when Napoleon did get on Beethoven's nerves, and that's during one of the many attacks on Austria by Napoleonic forces. The cannons were bombarding Vienna, and Beethoven had to hide out in the basement of his living quarters, putting pillows over his ears to protect what little hearing he had left. Exciting times. And then there's the late Enlightenment, in which freedoms gained through revolutionary and Enlightenment thinking, not to mention a strong reaction against the Reign of Terror, created a counter-movement, which we now call the Romantic Age. One can almost imagine Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire or Rousseau rolling in their graves thinking, we broke you out of feudalism for this emotional, overexcited music and literature? During the debate, participants will hear this little reminder, which, anyway, they'll hear a little chime announcing that they are at the end of their allotted time. And if they go significantly over that, we will call the hotel clerk to remove them with this signal. And then they know it's all over. Now, just before we hear from Tom Allen for the affirmative, let's hear Victoria and Atis play Chrysler's Rondino on a theme of Beethoven. And thank you again, Victoria and Atis. Yes, applause. And now, speaking for the affirmative, resolved, Beethoven represents the best of who we are. We have the opening argument by CBC Music's Tom Allen.
Peter, and let me, I learned just before we started that I have a 30-second warning track that I didn't know about before. So I'm going to take a few of those seconds to say, Atis and Victoria, how fantastic to hear your beautiful playing. Such a joy. And to say hello to my fellow respected panelists, William, Julie, nice to see you here. Even Robert, my opponent, brings me pleasure to see his face. And thank you, Peter, for doing such a great job. All right, got my timer ready here. Ludwig van Beethoven represents the best of who we are because he never gave up. True, he created some of the most known and singable melodies in history. For example, da da dee 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 dee, or ya dee da 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 da. Even the most tweetable, the best soundbite in sonic history, ba 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 ba. Incredible achievements to have created these things that have stayed with us for so long. In addition to that, works of marvelous complexity, the late sonatas, the late quartets, including the fantastic Grosse Fuga, which Igor Stravinsky, no less, rightly said would always remain contemporary. But no, those reasons are not why Beethoven represents the best of who we are. It's true that he accomplished those things, coming from a childhood of neglect and emotional mistreatment, and that he redefined the role of the artist in society, and that he was able to carry on with his pioneering and heroic work despite pain and health struggles that simply overwhelmed the crude medical systems of the day, and that he lived through political and military turbulence that could have easily derailed any of us. Not even the cruelest blow that the most visionary and resourceful musician in history had to do all of that without functional hearing for the last 25 years of his life. Hard to believe. The incomprehensible truth is that with most of his greatest compositions, he never heard them anywhere but in his own imagination. And that deafness meant that he was isolated. Even as his art became deeper and more powerful, his deafness slowly removed him from society so that the society, the love that he needed, was more and more away from him. But no, none of that is why he represents the best of who we are. Ludwig van Beethoven represents the best of who we are because he never gave up. Against horrible obstacles, Beethoven never lost hope, never. His art may inspire the greatest among us, but his hope and his perseverance are a model for greatness that not only overachievers can look to, but that relate to every single one of us. 2 minutes and 7 seconds. How do you like that?
Perfect timing. Perfect timing. Well, thank you so much, Tom. And now, before we hear from Robert, let's hear a Beethoven bagatelle with Victoria. Thank you. Thank you very much, Victoria, for that Beethoven Bagatelle, Opus 119, number 1. And now, arguing for the negative, we have Robert Harris.
Thanks, Peter. I guess this is the first time I can say that I'm glad that I'm on Zoom so that nobody can throw things at me as I'm about to make my case. But if you look at your icons, there's a rotten tomato icon along with the applauding one that you can throw at me, because I'm going to do the impossible and suggest not only that Beethoven doesn't represent the best of us, he may represent the worst of us. And I say this as a Beethoven guy. I mean, Beethoven changed my life as he did for so many of us, I'm thinking. But it's funny, Atis talked about the 200th anniversary back in 1970. I think we're in a different position today than we were then. And to me, the reason that Beethoven is suspect has everything to do with the time in which he emerged in the world, exactly what Peter was talking about in the French Revolution. He was a child of the Revolution. Bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven, said William Wordsworth, who was born exactly the same year as Beethoven, 1770. So what was the real meaning of the French Revolution is that all of the supports that gave meaning to life were kicked away. The monarchy was kicked away, religion was kicked away, the state was kicked away, and people were left with just themselves and their wits and their personality. We see this as liberating, and it was, but it's also frightening. It was very precarious. Precarity is at the essence of what Beethoven is. And my problem with Beethoven, and why I think he doesn't provide a model for us anymore, is that Beethoven responded to that precarity by power, by embracing power in music. You know, the very power that we love in the music, we don't hear because we don't perform it properly, in my opinion, for what it is, which is violence. There's so much violence in Beethoven. Oh my God, like really, so much dissonance, so much rhythmic. Those sforzandos in Beethoven should be like a call in the middle of your head. And we don't play them that way anymore. We've smoothed Beethoven over. We've taken that violence out of the music. And where is the violence? Just about anywhere you look. That first sonata, you know, that second theme, I've played this piece, is a rolling E natural in the left hand and an F natural in the right hand, an extraordinary dissonance, which Beethoven marked with a sforzando. He wants you to hear the ugliness in his music, and his music is ugly, you know? I mean, what's the opening to the Ninth Symphony, last movement? That incredible dissonance, right? And even the melody that Tom was talking about, you know, the Ode to Joy, it's a march. You know, it's a march. Beethoven was a violent composer. He was a composer of power, let's put it that way. And we've turned that power into, we've fetishized it. That sense of overcoming, that sense of always emerging victorious. It's made us very, very unsubtle, you know. So I'm not going to blame Beethoven for the fact that the Third Reich loved him, because it's not his fault. But you know, they weren't playing Mozart at the Nuremberg rallies, you know? There was something in Beethoven that lends himself to that sense of power and violence and overcoming of the other, which I think is not a good model for us anymore. It doesn't provide us what we want. I find it almost impossible to listen to Beethoven anymore, because especially the middle period Beethoven that Peter was talking about, because it is so angry, you know? And I just don't think that's the model we need, so that Beethoven, in fact, doesn't represent anymore the best of who we are.
Perfect. Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Tom. You will each have 2 minutes for closing arguments, and in between that, we'll also have 1 minute for rebuttal. But before we get to those 1-minute rebuttals, let's hear Victoria Kogan play yet another Beethoven Bagatelle. Thank you, Victoria, for that Beethoven Bagatelle Opus 119, number 5. And now it's time for those 1-minute rebuttals. First, from Tom Allen.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Victoria. Robert, I hear what you're saying, and I can't disagree, but I think that violence is good. I think it's important. I think it's important for the art of the day to be able to last into future years. And Beethoven, it's true, was not afraid of bringing violence to music. The danger is that we tend to treat it with kid gloves, that we try to make it this piece of china that needs to be cherished. It's not. It's violent, angry music, and at times, it's also self-mocking music. To me, this is the part of Beethoven that's most amazing, that in between these giant heroic outbursts in which he took a Napoleonic stance on things, he also made fun of himself. You know, these bagatelles that Victoria is playing are from the very end of his compositional life, the last piano pieces he wrote, the Opus 119, and they're full of self-mockery. And they're full of self-deprecating humor, and they consistently pull their punches, something that he wouldn't have done as a younger guy. But when he got to the end of his life, I think he saw that he was part of this grand comedy. And although it was important to stand up and raise a fist and shout and try to bring down unfair laws and unfair establishments, he also knew that he was just as susceptible to self-deception and to self-mockery as anyone could be. Look at that, right under the wire, I tell you.
Pretty good.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Let's see. And now the rebuttal from Robert Harris.
Okay, Tom, we're agreeing with each other as we disagree, that self-deprecation is clearly there Beethoven's humor as a person, he made the worst puns in the world. As a composer, he makes the worst puns in the world, but it's sort of self-hating in a way, So I won't, because I only have a minute, bother with the whole Beethoven represents Western culture and colonial, because, he does, but so does everybody else. We have to understand Beethoven was that that change of himself, looking at himself. That's the way he lived his life, too. We think of Beethoven, you mentioned it, is this great French revolutionary character. This is a guy who took his patrons to court to keep up the annuity they were giving him because post-war inflation in Austria rendered the amount that they had given him almost useless, and he sued them. He was hardly a revolutionary. He was hardly a Democrat. Beethoven was everything, but he was Gould calls him, he says he was busy being Beethoven, and Gould's not always right about Beethoven, but he was right in this respect. Beethoven is too conflicted to be a hero to us, and he's leading us down wrong paths. But what might have worked for 1820s doesn't work for the 2020s. It's leading us the wrong way. Oh man, you beat me to a guy. 4 seconds over, right?
That doesn't detract from your argument, though, Robert. I'll be smug in my radio self, knowing that I finished before the news break, and we can.
Yeah, okay. And I went over, and so it was like Wally Ballou. Remember, Bob and Ray's Lee Ballou. Is always cut off. Still will understand that reference.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Tom. Remember, you each have 2 minutes for closing arguments, so it's not over yet. Before those, we'll hear 2 guest perspectives, one from CBC Music's Julie Nesrallah and one from the Toronto Star's William Littler. Please know, everyone watching, if you're watching on YouTube, you can leave questions for the panelists over in the comment section to your right. Also, if you're using the Watch Live feature on the Music Niagara website, you can leave questions in the comments area as well. And we'll select a few to ask our distinguished panel at the end of the program. But first, let's hear Atis and Victoria play the scherzo from Beethoven's Violin Sonata number 10. Thank you, Victoria. And thank you, Atis, for that scherzo from Beethoven's Violin Sonata number 10. And now for our two guest perspectives. First, from CBC Music's Julie Nesrallah, and then from the Toronto Star's William Littler, both still on the topic. Beethoven represents the best of who we are. Julie.
Yes, hello. Thrilled to be here. I feel like 3 minutes isn't long enough. I feel like we need to take it outside with a bottle of scotch and then really get down with this business. I am on Team Tom Allen for a bunch of reasons, but I have to say that one of the things I tell my non-classical music friends when they ask me why I'm so obsessed with Beethoven, why I think he's so great, and I say because Beethoven, for the simple fact, made everything that came after him possible. Beethoven made Elvis possible. Beethoven made Madonna possible. Without being able to express yourself, you wouldn't have anything that we have today. John Coltrane, imagine a world without John Coltrane. I really do believe that all of these people who are geniuses in their own way were made possible by virtue of the fact that Beethoven was utterly human and utterly fearless. So to Robert Harris's point about the violence and the grief and the ugliness, I feel like that's a plus on my side. I feel the fact that Beethoven was so completely and utterly fearless to display as much as he did, and then be able to also apologize, not only in his music, but I mean, there's this beautiful letter that he wrote begging a friend of his to forgive him. And it's one of the most beautiful, heartfelt apologies. So for every reaction that Beethoven's having, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And I think that there is no other composer in the world who sort of envelops that all-encompassing humanity, for better or for worse. And I also feel that he deserves a special place because of the one opera that he wrote. Beethoven wrote one opera, where the lead character is a woman who dresses up like a man, so she gets dressed up and dragged to go save her man from political prison. So for all of these reasons and more, I feel that Beethoven is more relevant than ever because it's undeniable. He's still around, and the most popular ringtone being downloaded by people around the world is the tune to Fur-Elise. And I will end it there. Did I make it in time?
Oh,
I can keep going.
You need to unmute Peter. Peter doesn't realize he's still muted. You need to unmute Peter.
I have unmuted, and I'm going to tell you, Julie, you really had 60 seconds left over if you want to take your at a time.
Well, can I ask you, hey, Julie,
yeah,
about Beethoven as a vocal composer? I've heard singers that sort of whisper, they won't say it very, very much in the public, but they'll say, he's not great to sing. Is that true?
It is true. That was the other part that I was going to add. I was just checking on the time that he wasn't a great vocal composer because I'm not sure why. I guess it just didn't speak to him. I mean, I've sung the Ninth and I've done some of his Irish and Scottish songs. The Irish and Scottish songs he did, he took the tune was already there. I find, and then he would embellish around them and create a piano trio around these old Scottish melodies. What I find most interesting was the subject matter that he chose. The Scottish songs that he picked, they're always about some guy who falls in love with a girl and then never gets the girl at the end. She goes to somebody else, which is exactly what his life was about. Always a bridesmaid, never a bride. Mm-hmm. And in the Ninth, all the mezzos who get hired to sing the Ninth basically say, well, I can just sit there and go, and everybody will think I'm singing because the vocal line is so buried amidst all the orchestra people and all the rest of the soloists with the soprano singing right up here. You're like, you know what, dude? I could so phone this in and nobody would know. But every time I do sing Beethoven's Ninth, I actually get a little bit hoarse because I'm screaming my brains out because I'm so filled with passion and so filled with the soul of this revolutionary that, you got to sing your heart out. But yeah, it is true. He wasn't the great the greatest composer for voice, but I'm willing to forgive this little indiscretion, vocal indiscretion, because of all the other things I mentioned. How about that, Peter?
That's wonderful. And thank you very much. Great question, Tom. And now with another guest perspective from the Toronto Star, William Littler.
I have to admit that as Julie was more on Tom's side, I'm really more on Robert's side, probably because we both spent several years throwing stones at the same objects. And part of the reason for my being there is autobiographical, if you'll forbid my saying. When I was a young music student in Vancouver, my teacher was very proud of the fact that her teacher was the first graduate of the Toronto Conservatory of Music, which is now the Royal Conservatory. He's now forgotten. His name was J.D. Tripp. Well, Mr. Tripp, after he graduated from the conservatory, went to Europe to study with Leschetizky. And my teacher was very proud of the fact that Leschetizky was then taught by Liszt, who was then taught by Czerny, who was then taught by Beethoven. So my pedigree goes from Beethoven to my teacher, and she would tell me this and then say, as if to say, and now it has come to this. So I bear a great burden on my shoulders as a piano student, and I've never been able to forgive Beethoven for that. But I'm not the only one, because I am very fond of the 19th century art critic John Ruskin from England, who said that Beethoven's music sounds like the upturning of bags of nails with once in a while a dropped hammer. In other words, we didn't all think he was beautiful. And in fact, one of the great critics of the early years of the 20th century in New York, by the way, that was a golden age of criticism, Gilman, Fink, Krehbiel, Honecker. I've got books by all of them, and they were very civilized men. Honecker was in fact called the critic of the seven arts because of his versatility. But he said about Beethoven, Beethoven is not beautiful. And in fact, what's matter with him was he was the champion of the ego, and that many lesser composers following him have followed the example of their own ego, looked into themselves, and found all the selfishness and ugliness which is characteristic of contemporary music. So there. It's all blamed on Beethoven, and with very good reason. And he was also, let's face it, not a very nice man. Our resolution doesn't say this specifically, but there's an implied moral quality of the standard that he sets for us too. And I don't think it's a good one. There's a famous anecdote that Beethoven and Goethe were taking a walk, and they were approached by a royal party. Goethe stepped aside politely, and Beethoven pulled his hat down over his head and stomped through the royal party as if to say, I'm as much a prince as you are. He was the champion of the ego. And although you can say, and I do say, there is a good side to this, in lesser people, it's brought out the bad side. There's nothing like an egotistical composer. They don't get any more egotistical than composers. And when you're not of Beethoven's caliber, we have to suffer the consequences of that. So we have to be careful about all the good that we find in Beethoven's music, but there isn't a moral quality that's quite so admirable. That's always been a big question. Do we judge composers by their personal morality as well as their creative genius? You know, that Wagner is the big example. People always say, yes, he was a monster, but he created great music. Well, I always think of what Woody Allen said in response to that he couldn't bear to listen to Wagner because it always made him want to invade Poland. So there is another side to all this. And when you bring in the personal morality, Beethoven doesn't stand quite so tall. In fact, he's downright a pygmy. So let's think that If we like Beethoven in spite of Beethoven, not because of Beethoven. The music, yes, but you have to bring out whether the composer is the music or whether he is a conduit for the music. And I would argue that he's a conduit. Bach, by the way, made the same argument, that the inspiration was God's. He was merely a conduit for it. Well, if you take that point of view, I think you can speak very highly of Beethoven, and you don't have to worry about the fact that he was not a very pleasant human being. In fact, he was probably one of the least pleasant human beings among the great composers. Mozart is always laughed at, thanks to Amadeus, the play by Peter Shaffer in the subsequent movie, because he giggled like Tom Hanks, giggled and made himself a fool. Well, that was fine, because basically, morally, he was okay. He may not have been physically all that responsible, but he was okay. He was not cheating his publishers, as Beethoven was, and he wasn't insulting his patrons, as Beethoven was. So you have to put this into perspective. If you think morally, don't think too hard. It's a very unpleasant task. If you think in terms of the sheer conduit function for genius that came to him, then I think Beethoven is okay.
Okay. Thank you, William, and thank you, Julie. And remember, everyone watching, you can ask questions. Use the comments features to the right on either YouTube or Watch Now. And we'll select a few to ask the panel at the end. Now, before Tom and Robert's closing arguments, Victoria will play another bagatelle from Beethoven's Opus 119. Thank you, Victoria, for that Beethoven Bagatelle Opus 119, number 3. And now we'll hear the closing arguments for this year's great debate, Resolved, Beethoven represents the best of who we are. We'll hear from Tom, but since he got to open, we'll first hear from Robert.
Sorry. I don't know if this is possible. Can we just replay what Bill Littler said for my closing remarks? It's just about perfect, right? And go back to what Bill was talking about, ego. So here's my thing about Beethoven. We need to redeem Beethoven. There's another Beethoven, lurking there that we sometimes pay attention to, but don't pay enough attention to. So I said before that the essence of the French Revolution, the essence of Beethoven, the need for that ego was the precariousness, the fact that we were on our own, right? It's the world we still live in. We're on our own. We look to ourselves. That can lead you to be aggressive, and it can lead you to be contemplative, and it can lead you to be compassionate, because we're all in the same boat. Beethoven, for most of his life, picked door one. you know, beat them down. I could beat Beethoven. I mean, could beat Napoleon, he said, if we were ever to fight, you know. He was a Napoleon in his mind. And then sometimes in the middle of his career, this Song Without Words, which is the second movement of Opus 90, the piano sonata, unbelievably beautiful piece of music, maybe the best melody he ever wrote. And then, of course, all those late works. What happened in the late works? Beethoven basically had a nervous breakdown, right? He had a nervous breakdown around the time that he was fighting his sister-in-law for the custody of Karl. And those stories, I mean, if you think, you know, Beethoven acted poorly most of his life, the stories of how poorly he acted in those years of the custody suit are outrageous. He really lost it, right? People felt he was written out and done, including him. And then those late works, Beethoven lost the ego and connected to something that's so wonderful and so close to breaking down. We play those late works too cleanly. They should almost always be breaking down. At every moment, we should figure, oh my God, this is just going to die out, right? So there's another Beethoven. If we recovered that Beethoven, I think we could find more in him that could provide a model for what we want to do. So he's not a completely lost cause, but we need to redeem him. Because the Beethoven that we love in today's world, you know, in today's world is different from the world of 50 years ago, of 20 years ago. It's not a model for us anymore. It sends us in the wrong direction. That late Beethoven, I think, makes us more compassionate, more understanding, and sends us in the right direction.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Robert, for that closing argument. And now, Tom, you have 2 minutes for your closing argument.
Once again, I find myself in the strange position of agreeing with my opponent in many ways. And you know, we talked a lot about the heroic era, the middle period works that are so inspiring and that have become, I think, as Julie rightly said, the inspiration for center stage performers like Elvis and Madonna. You know, the Eroica Symphony. And it was Robert Harris who told me the story of the premiere of the Eroica when the old man in the balcony stood up and said, "I'll pay another $1 if it'll just stop." You know, so that kind of violent clashing dissonance was new because it was the first time that people were really hearing the reality of human existence. And I think our looking to Beethoven to lead us lands on the time we're in now, in which leadership so often goes to ego and nowhere else. Yeah, I agree completely that we're living in an age when ego is destroying much of what our society has spent these 200 years building up. And if we look to Beethoven, you know, from that middle period, we're looking at the angry young man trying to change society. Well, that isn't needed now. That society does not need to be torn down. It needs to be compassionate. It needs to be self-aware. And the later Beethoven, as Robert was saying, really does give us a view on humility and on deliberation. This is the other thing about Beethoven I think is really important. You know, by the end of his days, he had a musical capacity, a facility to create musical art, unlike anyone before him in many ways. And yet he didn't just dash things off. He didn't just write stuff down and send it out into the world like the genius could. He deliberated over everything, always. And as he went on, his music got more and more spare and more reduced because he knew how important it was to say, yes, we need ego. Yes, we need strength. Yes, we need rebellion. But most of all, we need self-reflection and awareness. Mm-hmm. And if that could be a model for leadership today, then I think we'll do fine. I think perhaps it can represent the best of who we are. Thanks, Julie.
You're welcome.
You're muted, Peter.
Oh, thank you, Tom Allen, and thank you, Robert Harris, and thank you for those guest perspectives earlier from Julie and William. Very nice. My script says, summarize and conclude.
Good luck with that.
Good luck
with that. I can say that we have had one common thread has been ego, Beethoven's ego. Perhaps that's what made him great. Perhaps that's what we most dislike about Beethoven. But we still have room for questions at the end. We have 2 in so far. And one is dealing with Beethoven, Haydn, and Mozart. Another one is dealing with Beethoven, Bach, and Brahms. So if you have questions of a musical nature such as those, or any questions at all, use the comment section to the right of your YouTube feed or your Watch Live feed, and fill us out, and we'll get to those questions. But before we get to those questions, finale, musically for us, Victoria Kogan will play the first movement of Beethoven's Sonata Number 30. Wow. Thank you so much, Victoria, for that Beethoven Sonata Number 30 and all of the Beethoven selections, and of course, Atis Bankas as well. So we come to our Q&A section. We have a question which is open to anyone. Was Beethoven more influenced by Haydn, whom he did work with in Vienna, or by Mozart, who died just around the time that Beethoven finally made it to Vienna? So anyone, Beethoven, more influenced by Haydn or Mozart? Take it.
Okay, well, I'll jump in. I know that that he wanted to study with Mozart and had to go back home because of the death of his father, his mother. And as Peter alluded to, he actually had to go to court to have himself named as head of the family above his father. He was 18 years old because he was concerned about the welfare of his two younger brothers. And by the time then he got all that straightened out and got back to Vienna, Mozart was dead. So it is kind of a tempting thought to think of what would have happened if this young, blustery, ego-driven soloist could have studied with a probably more mature and more seasoned Mozart at that point. Because had Mozart survived that really difficult time in 1791, he too would have been much more humble. He would have learned how hard it is to have things not go your way. That's a really lovely thought. But whether he's actually influenced by Mozart in that way, I'm not sure. I think Haydn had a lot more to do with the way Beethoven ended up sounding than Beethoven ever wanted to admit.
He did. In fact, you look at the foundations of his quartets, you find them in Haydn, and likewise the symphonies. Haydn, probably of all the great composers, is the least appreciated for the stature he represented. He did everything pretty well before other people did it as well. And he had an extraordinary versatility. So Haydn they don't call him Papa Haydn for nothing.
And a beautiful diplomat, a beautiful personality who was able to negotiate and deal with tempers and deal with big personalities and still maintain his own integrity and his own sense of class. I adore Haydn, in particular the early symphonies. I find them just filled with so much energy and fun and humor. But I'm particularly attracted to his personality as well. So no wonder they clashed. Right. When they got together.
He wasn't as lucky in marriage, but you can't have everything.
They did study together. I mean, Beethoven did study with Haydn. They had a real love-hate relationship with each other. So the best story is that, Haydn accepted the fee from the, Elector of Cologne, who was Beethoven's boss, sent back the compositions that Beethoven had been working on with Haydn, and the Elector said, "We heard these in Bonn. We heard these before he left," so Haydn basically faked it. And then there's a story that after The Creatures of Prometheus, I think it was, the ballet, and, Haydn said, "Well, not bad." And Beethoven said, "Well, it's no, was it The Creation?" and Haydn's greatest oratorio. And Haydn sort of looked at him and said, "Well, yeah, I guess it isn't." So they had a very unusual relationship, these two. But I think I think Mozart and Beethoven. I think Mozart might have ruined Beethoven. Mozart
that's interesting thought.
Yeah, too idiosyncratic. Beethoven loved Mozart, learned a lot from, but I don't think he would have been a good teacher. Too individual.
Right.
The English writer Colin Wilson once said that it's a pity that Beethoven was the standard set for our century. It should have been Mozart. It would have been a healthier musical life if we had taken our cue from Mozart.
Thank you. We also have a question from Michael about the three Bs, Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. Does Beethoven deserve to stand among them? Before you answer that question, I would like our audience to understand that, yes, it has come down to us, Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, but it was not Brahms initially. It was Berlioz. And Berlioz was a wild man. So I think Beethoven would have been in much better company with Berlioz.
Right.
But what do you guys think?
It's never been Beethoven, really, who's been in doubt among those three. It's usually been Brahms.
Right.
Remember that George Bernard Shaw, who was quite a prominent music critic, in London in the 1890s said that Brahms was nowhere near as good a composer as Hermann Goetz.
Well, I think to his credit, Brahms also would have had a hard time agreeing with the idea that he deserved to be next to Beethoven. It terrified him for most of his life. Whereas Berlioz loved Beethoven, and there are moments in the Symphonie Fantastique that are right out of Eroica. That's very exciting to see where that would have gone. However, if our concern today is not too much ego and not too much violence, it's probably best that we steered away from Berlioz when we did.
Berlioz needs to bus off in that category. Oh my God. The story about his attempted murder plot. I mean, that is just, you just can't make that stuff up. It's unbelievable.
In women's clothing, too. Cross-dressing
in women's
murder.
clothing.
Yeah.
And then he was on the way to commit this murder and then forgot something and decided, oh, maybe I shouldn't do this. Think? What a nut job. That's why they called him the lunatic, I suppose. Well, for his music, because it was so avant-garde to the ear, but he was a lunatic for real.
Yep.
We have another question, but did you want to weigh in, Robert Harris, on Bach?
No, I was just going back to Bill saying that, we wonder about Brahms in that trio. We never, ever think about putting Mozart in that trio.
I know.
To go back to Bill's.
We should, yeah.
It's interesting because they're the Germanic tradition that, for good or ill, we have used to define our musical tradition around the world, I might add, and still. And masculine, Germanic, contrapuntal, and it's very deadening, boy. I would hate to be a young music student today, with that. Brahms talked about having the weight of Beethoven on his shoulders. How about have the weight of all three of those guys on your shoulder?
Mm-hmm.
Not fair.
It is interesting to wonder where we'll go from here because we've kind of reached the apex of the artist prophet that Beethoven really codified, right? He kind of declared himself to be an artist prophet, whereas before that, like Bach he would not have called himself a prophet. He was a servant. He was writing music that he hoped would please his church bosses and maybe God, and that was it. So we've kind of with online streaming and with the death of live performance now, we've kind of got to the point where musicians are going to have a hard time hanging on to the idea that they're prophets. There aren't any prophets, and they're going to have to figure that out. So we may be coming back.
It's interesting if you ever visit the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig and walk up the center aisle toward the chancel, that's where Bach is buried under a slab of marble. And when you look up there, the only thing written on the slab is Johann Sebastian Bach, 1685 to 1750. And then you notice something's wrong. The numbers and the letters are upside down. And then you realize that's because they're not pointed toward the congregation. They're pointed toward the altar, right, toward God.
Yeah.
And that attitude made him a humble artist of a very high order. When the artist became much more concerned that it is from him, that I think we got into a little more trouble.
Yeah, agreed.
And well, at least the final question, as far as I can read, about 5 years ago, the BBC magazine asked 150 or so conductors worldwide for their most outstanding piece. And the top pick, according to the questioner, was Eroica, Beethoven's Symphony No. 3. Do any of you agree or disagree?
Well, when I was on...
You can say, on a simple level, that everything changed.
Mm-hmm.
No symphony was of that scale before the Eroica. And no orchestra was of that scale before the Eroica. Although, I must say, if you visit Vienna, the hall in which it was premiered is still there in a palace, and it's only a ballroom, and it's small. The orchestras were smaller too, but I mean, the audience must have felt it was being blown out of the walls. But anyway, that was a scale that was entirely different. And all symphonic writing can be said, I think, after that, to date from the Eroica. So big deal indeed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would say from a radio broadcaster's perspective, Peter and Julie, you can say if you agree. When you play music again and again and again, when I was on the morning show for 11 years, there are some that you think, well, I don't think I need to hear that again. That happens. That never happened to me with Beethoven.
Me too.
I never got tired of it. So
can you imagine the nerve of the man beginning a symphony with 3 loud chords? Nobody had ever dared do that before.
Right.
It was quite outrageous, and the man was outrageous. Small wonder they didn't like him.
Yeah.
No, I agree with you, Tom. I feel that way about the third, and when I talk about it on tempo as well, I try to say this is the big game changer. This is the symphonic game changer, and I think even the last time I played it, I said it's a miracle. I think it's one of the last great miracles in the world when you don't get tired of something, when something continues to reinvigorate you, to fill your soul, and to elevate the mundane of everyday life. And not only is it doing that, but it shifted the landscape for everything that we have today. I couldn't agree with you more. I'm a massive fan of that one, the 6th and the 5th, even with, the old tired ba 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 ba. I love the 5th. It's never boring. I love the transition between the 3rd and 4th move. I love it all. I just lose my marbles every time. Like I'm air conducting and there isn't a singer in any of these things. I am a diehard. I have to admit.
We'd better take up a collection so we can give you some marbles.
Robert?
It's all I would say is, of all the great masterpieces of music, it took me longer to come to the Eroica than any other single piece that I know. I had to listen to that over and over and over again before I could really get the scale of that first movement.
Yeah.
I couldn't figure out what that C sharp was doing there. I couldn't figure out the dissonance. It took me a long time. But for me, my favorite Beethoven symphony is the 7th by far. It's just sheer
Wasn't
power.
that his favorite too?
I don't know. It could
I
be.
think he said he liked the 8th.
The 8th better,
He
right?
liked the little ones.
Because the 7th was so well liked.
I
Right.
think so.
Right.
Well, Wagner called it the 7th, the apotheosis of the dance. But what did he know?
Yeah. But you're right, and that's so typically Beethoven. Everyone loved the 7th.
Right.
He had some experience, but they're cattle. They're cattle,
Right.
They don't understand. The 8th is the genius symphony. Very funny. That's it for our questions. I'm going to say thank you and then turn things over to Atis. But definitely thank you to our guest perspectives, Julie Nesrallah and William Littler. And thank you to Robert Harris and to Tom Allen. And this has been just great. So thank you all. Thank you, everyone, for viewing. And Atis, take us out.
Thank you very, very much, everybody. It was really fascinating evening, afternoon, and this event. I enjoyed it so much. I just wanted to add, it takes really imperfect personality, imperfect human being to create this kind of art and genius masterpieces that he created. If he was more normal, he probably would follow the footsteps of his father and grandfather singing in a choir, and that would be it. So obviously, and we embrace those shortcomings, and I think why musicians, performers particularly, appreciate not just that overcoming all the difficulties from physical to moral, etc. But we are not perfect. Musicians do realize more than you think that we are not perfect and far from it. And maybe the ego is something masquerading, or trying to camouflage those imperfections.
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway, that's 2 cents from me. Thank you so much, everybody that tuned in and listened and looked. I really enjoyed all the debaters, And thank you, Peter, for hosting and moderating. I think it was a fabulous event. Really loved it. And I hope that everybody will tune in next Sunday to the next show at Music Niagara. Thank you so much. Until then.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.